All right, today to round off week 7, we're going to be talking about Susan B. Anthony and the essay she wrote when she went on a speaking tour after the 1872 federal election. And in that federal election, Anthony voted illegally. It was illegal for women to vote in the 1872 election. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, as we'll discuss. So Anthony voted illegally to make a point, and then went on a speaking tour to sort of present her position to other towns in New England, and had a lot of success. And this, so what we're reading today is the essay she wrote for that after her illegal voting in the 1872 federal election. And we're going to take a look at her arguments in that essay and talk a little bit about the history of the movement after the Civil War as well, leading up to the final decision to grant women suffrage in 1920, the 19th Amendment. All right, so if we take a look at Anthony's arguments in the essay we're reading, you'll notice from the beginning of the second paragraph, she mentions this idea of natural rights. And the essay itself, the basic argument that she makes for women needing the right to vote, and that and that argument is based on this idea. So in that second paragraph, she starts off by saying, a democratic republican government is based on the idea of the natural right of every individual member thereof to a voice and a vote in making and executing laws. Okay, so obviously she intends to include women in that natural right, and she believes, as we'll see, that these rights are inalienable. They can't be granted or taken away. So she uses this argument to support the idea of women's right to vote, and bases it on this idea of natural rights, which sort of goes beyond the Constitution. So it's something that cannot be taken away by law. So if we ask what are natural rights, people talk about rights in a variety of contexts. You can have a sort of right established by a legal claim. You can have a right to an attorney, that sort of thing. So a natural right is a right which does not depend upon any of the laws or customs of any country. So they're not specific to any set of laws, they're not specific to any country, and they are considered to be both universal and inalienable. Universal means that they're afforded to everybody, so everybody who comes under the category of human being is included as a sort of as somebody who has these natural rights. So everybody's included. There are no exclusions. And the inalienable part of it means that they cannot be taken away, right? So you cannot forfeit them, you cannot give them up, you cannot lose them. So there's nothing you can do to sort of to lose them. For example, some rights nowadays in the United States depend upon good behavior. You can have the right to vote taken away if you commit a felony in some states. So the idea of inalienability suggests that that's impossible, right? So for natural rights, there's nothing you can do to forfeit the right, and they can't be taken away. Now, an early exponent, an influential exponent of the idea of natural rights was the English philosopher John Locke. Locke argued for the idea of a state of nature that exists sort of before society, with nobody to judge the disputes, that this state of nature exists before people make what he calls a social contract to form a society and government. And as Locke sees it, the state of nature is not a state of war like it is for some other early philosophers like Thomas Hobbes. The state of nature just lacks a common judge to resolve disputes, so disputes can sort of get out of hand and be unable to resolve if there's not a sort of common authority to judge them. So Locke argues that the justification for making a contract to join society and be bound by its laws, that sort of decision to make a contract comes from this position where we exist before government, and then we form a contract to protect our natural rights. So it sort of secures our rights. We don't have disputes like we do in the state of nature, where people sort of disagree about what it means. So we sort of form a social contract in order to protect and secure the rights that we already hold before forming a government. So this is a typical early sort of liberal theory of government, that it's founded to protect these rights. So Locke often referred to the scope of these rights as life, liberty, and property. You'll notice in the Declaration of Independence that's changed slightly to the idea of life, liberty, and happiness. But the same basic idea, that there are some basic rights to life and freedom and capability that are inalienable, that can't be taken away. So in society, people retain these natural rights, including for Locke, and this is an important part of Anthony's argument, in fact. People also retain for Locke their right to revolution if their natural rights are violated. So people set up society to defend and protect their natural rights. Society is bigger and better able to sort of defend them than any individual. However, if the society becomes corrupt, say it becomes tyrannical and starts violating people's natural rights, according to Locke, people retain a right to revolution, a right to rebellion, if their natural rights are violated. So that's always retained. So people always have this right to sort of take back their natural rights if they are violated by government action. Now, similarly to Locke, Susan B. Anthony argues that when people enter into society and government, they do not give away their natural rights. They retain all the rights that they had as a result of being human beings. So she writes, and when 100 or 1 million people enter into a free government, they do not barter away or exchange away their natural rights. They simply pledge to protect each other in the enjoyment of them. Right? So again, that's the key thing that links Anthony with Locke, that we join a government to protect each other's natural rights and to be able to better protect each other's natural rights and to enjoy them more fully. We don't sort of change them or give them up, and so we retain them in the event that government doesn't sort of respect the natural rights that people have. Now, the really crucial step in Anthony's argument is a claim that in order to protect their own natural rights, each individual human being, and that includes each individual woman, must be given the right to vote. Okay, so that's the claim she makes, that she takes from Locke this idea that we set up government to defend our natural rights, and then she says, well, if that idea is going to have any teeth, if that idea is going to work, right, then it must be the case that each person has the right to vote, because otherwise it's impossible for them to defend their natural rights. So Anthony says, it is downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty, while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic republican government, the ballot. Right? So the only way of securing those blessings of liberty, our natural rights, is by having the right to vote, the vote to secure your own rights. Without that sort of recourse, right, women are completely at the mercy of others who may give up, who may decide, they want to compromise on women's natural rights. So this, having the ballot, having the right to vote, gives them the right to vote, and thereby gives them the opportunity to protect their natural rights. So that's the argument she's making between natural rights, the ballot, and protecting protecting the rights that we already have. But of course, in order to do that, we need to be able to sort of exercise judgment, to be able to to, to give our opinion on when our rights are violated, and the vote successfully serves that purpose. So the right to vote for Anthony is essential to keep hold of our natural rights. So it's interesting to reflect here again that whereas Anthony's arguing here in 1872, the right to vote for all women was not achieved, in theory at least, until the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So, that's a long time period. It's more than half a century. And of course, Anthony had been arguing for women's right to vote long before this time. She'd been a key player in the suffrage movement throughout the 19th century. So, and Anthony had died by the time of 1920. She passed away about 10 years before, I think. So she didn't actually get to see this sort of crowning achievement of the women's suffrage movement. So it's another useful reminder, I think, of how long it takes for things to move and how long it takes for things to shift. And sometimes, and we saw this with Gandhi as well, the struggle takes many decades. And it's, you have to keep going and not be discouraged and keep the movement going during all those decades, which is not an easy thing to do. So it's interesting to observe the sort of just the time frame here and how long it took until the progress they were calling for actually happened. So the 19th Amendment states, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay, so what this meant effectively was that you couldn't deny the right to vote on the basis of sex. You couldn't have a voting system set up to give all men the right to vote and to deny it to all women. So it solved that particular problem, right? And in theory, it made possible, because it didn't recognize, any separate rights for white women as opposed to women of color. All women are given the same right here in this 19th Amendment. All women are given right to vote, right? So it's a universal thing, but the restrictions continue to keep happening in practice. So even though the 19th Amendment is intended to guarantee the vote for all women, this did not actually happen. And you can see here how African American voter turnout in the South declined rapidly. And it would have been, of course, men voting at this time from 1876 up until 1920. But you can see how that turnout sort of diminished radically from the end of the Civil War right up to the 1920s. And that was because of the introduction of so-called Jim Crow segregation in the South of the country, which meant that black women and black men as well were still systematically denied the right to vote. So this sort of speaks to a central feature of the system in the United States, the voting and electoral system, which is that it's individual states that retain control of elections and retain control of procedures and practices on who is entitled to vote, right? So the constitutional amendment in 1920 said all women are entitled to vote, that you can't have restrictions based on sex. But what emerged in the Jim Crow South was a series of restrictions on voting that ended up being about sort of competency or intelligence qualifications. And so there's a variety of these completely bogus tests were developed in a load of southern states. And these completely bogus tests were only applied to African Americans. They were the only ones who were for whom they were said to be necessary, and they didn't actually, they were just tricks and attempts to disenfranchise people, not serious tests of a capability to vote. So those means were used to sort of drive down the African American vote and to virtually eliminate it in many parts of the South. So even though the 19th Amendment was passed, African American women in the South didn't get the vote until many, many years later, after the Civil Rights Movement. And that question of voting has come back to today, as today a lot of states are in the South are sort of renewing the practice of putting restrictions on voting, and that's again causing a lot of controversy. All right, so after the Civil War, if we trace the history for a little bit, what we see is that the women's suffrage movement, of which Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been central parts, the movement split on the question of race, and this was because of the consequences of emancipation and the fact that the major question that arose with emancipation was about whether the newly emancipated African American men were going to get the right to vote. And remember, at this stage, there's no recognized right to vote for women. So at the end of the Civil War, this is the question that emerges, and it's about African American men and their right to vote. So many core members of the movement, like Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at this stage, when this question begins to take precedence, so as they see it, their interest in women's voting is sort of being shunted to one side, and the question of African American men and their vote is becoming central in the wake of the Civil War. It's at this time that Anthony and Stanton begin to make arguments that showed certain traces of class and racial prejudice towards African Americans recently freed from slavery. And the general tenor of these arguments was, we're educated white women, surely we should have the vote before these ex-slaves who are not educated like us. So a lot of those kind of arguments and points were made, and this was sort of a feeling that their issues had been shunted to one side, and it caused this split on the question of race. So Anthony wrote at this time that, "We say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first and the Negro last." So Anthony is asking that the question of suffrage for women be decided before the question of African American men and the question of what's going to be done with emancipated slaves. And she's saying, look, we're educated people, we should have the first shot. So both Anthony and Stanton argued that white women were more deserving of the vote than black men who had just been freed from slavery. Another famous advocate in the women's suffrage movement, Sojourner Truth, profoundly disagreed with this point and argued that the threats faced by black women made their right to vote absolutely essential for their well-being. So you could make an argument the other way and argue that black women and men ought to have the right to vote first because there's a sort of direct relation between their ability to vote and their ability to defend their interests, which is doesn't have quite the same urgency with the case of sort of educated and typically fairly economically comfortable white women who were prominent in the economic suffrage movement. So this was the basis of the split that emerged sort of on the question of race after the Civil War. So the split started after the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War and was intended to give the vote to black men. The amendment stated that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are US citizens. So this meant that all black men should now enjoy the privileges conferred by states on citizens, including voting, right? So by saying they're citizens, you sort of give them access to all those privileges that states dole out, including the right to vote. So that was intended to resolve the question, although in fact it didn't. And it didn't because of the continued sort of the continued lack of access to the vote in the states, and the fact that was the states were making all kind of sort of qualifications to try to deny African Americans the vote. So the 15th Amendment was passed to try and secure this right again. And the 15th Amendment says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Right? So race or the fact of having been a slave is not a reason to deny the right to vote for anybody. Now, there's only a few states at this time that permitted equal voting for black men. So the 14th Amendment did in fact have some effect in the North. The only states before this that were permitting equal voting for black men along with white men were Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont, the New England states. New York State, along with many others, had a property requirement for black male voters. This was typical in the 19th century. You know, a lot of countries did this to have sort of property requirements to vote, and it meant that sort of voting was more of a kind of a habit of the wealthy or the well-to-do or the well-connected or professionals, but not for the sort of average citizen who didn't have enough property to pass the qualification. At the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1867, Anthony argued in favor of giving voting rights to all, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. And so that was her sort of general position, that this was the right thing to do, that the vote should be extended to everybody. Unfortunately, for Anthony's perspective, the word male was inserted into the document at some point, and a decision made to go for the more urgent cause of black male voting rights. So again, you see the sort of the same split, the split occurring here, that there's a decision to sort of prioritize those rights, which are seen as more urgent. And this again accelerated the split in the movement and led many suffragists to express their opposition in racist terms. You know, we're more sort of worthy, we're educated, etc., etc., and sort of deepening the split in the movement that happened. So, while always clear on the immorality of racial discrimination, Anthony felt justified in compromising on race after the Civil War because she felt, and this was her earnest view, that moral women would end slavery when they got the vote. So women would vote to end slavery, and women would sort of, you know, promote all these sort of positive and moral causes. That really didn't sort of meet. That didn't really meet the evidence that, you know, white women in the South were supporting Jim Crow and were supporting, you know, racism. So it's a difficult position to take in the when you actually see the history of what women voting and how that was sort of influenced by culture and race and everything else. But anyway, this was always part of Anthony's position, that there was a kind of moral quality to women, that they were sort of the caretakers of the nation, and they would solve these moral questions when they had the right to vote. So, you know, unfortunately, what Anthony said ignored the evidence that Southern white women would continue to support measures to disenfranchise African Americans in their own states, and of course that's what continued to happen right up until the Civil Rights Movement and the civil rights laws that finally began to remove that blockage of the right to vote. All right, so if we think about some conclusions for this paper, we've seen that Susan B. Anthony had a long and active career campaigning for women's suffrage and the abolition of slavery, and part of her influence was her sort of indefatigability, that she took this lecture and went from town to town trying to drum up support, and she sort of cared deeply about this cause. And cared deeply about the right to vote for all women, regardless of regardless of conditions of race or ethnicity or other features. And so she campaigned tirelessly for this idea and was quite influential, although of course she never got to see the 19th Amendment enacted. She died a good few years before that happened, and again that sort of shows what a long stretch it was to make that happen. Her arguments in the 1872 essay demonstrate her strong commitment to voting rights for all women without regard to race, religion, or property. After the Civil War, as we saw, the movement was blown off course by the new and urgent question of whether newly emancipated citizens would get voting rights. And supporters of women's suffrage like Anthony were not prepared to see their claims take a backseat when the question of voting rights for African American men became a central issue, and that caused the big split in the movement that occurred after the Civil War.